Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing really well. So I just saw Dumbo. Let's talk about it. Dumbo is directed by Tim Burton and stars Colin Farrell, Danny DeVito, Ava Green, and Michael Keaton. Tim Burton is, of course, a very famous or infamous director, depending on how you view his films. I personally really enjoy his films. I do appreciate his unique stylistic choices. He has a very distinct print when it comes to the films that he releases. There are films that I very much enjoyed, like Big Eyes and Corpse Bride and Edward Scissorhands, but I wouldn't say that they are my absolute favorite types of films to watch. Having said that, going into Dumbo, I was really interested in seeing what he would do with this story. I know that the original Dumbo was very short, endearing, but not remarkable cartoon. I do think that there was more room for improvement in Dumbo than there was for, say, Aladdin and The Lion King, which in my opinion are already perfect versions of themselves. So I was interested to see what he would add. In terms of the film that we managed to get from Tim Burton, I would say that this version of Dumbo is very sad. In general, it's a very tragic and bittersweet story. We'll get to all of the different elements that I found to be enjoyable or less enjoyable, but just the overall aesthetic of this film and the arcs of this film and the themes of this film, they're very sad. So without further ado, let's get into the bad, let's get into the good, let's get into this review of Dumbo. So first off, going into this film, already Dumbo isn't a story that I'm very invested in. I did think that there was more room for improvement with this film instead of the other two Disney live action remakes that are going to be coming this year. But having said that, I have to say that this doesn't really add much to the lore of Dumbo. What's really been done here is that they've added human characters in order for us as the audience to identify with those characters on an emotional level, because their thinking is perhaps it would be harder for us to identify with an animated character or a CG character in the form of Dumbo. And so we are basically experiencing the story of Dumbo through the eyes of these new human characters, whether it be Colin Farrell's father figure or the two kids. And I have to say that for the most part, that doesn't really work for me, because the best part of this film is still Dumbo, and he's still the character that you very much connect with the most in the entire film. So they've added all of these human elements to it, when in actuality, I didn't like a lot of the human elements that they added to it. There was some that I really did enjoy, which we'll get to that, but in general, I would say that Dumbo still shines the most out of all of them. And what's connected to this is the fact that I thought the performances in this film were very off. There were moments in this film that were supposed to be played up for comedy, but they missed the mark. And when you have someone like Danny DeVito, you know, he's so talented, he's a legend, he's amazing on Always Sunny, and he was basically doing the Always Sunny bit in this film, but just in a different context, and it worked. It 100% worked, and I think this film desperately needed something like him in order to sprinkle in some genuine comedy. But I have to say that there are even times when he's speaking and he's telling the joke and it doesn't land, and the timing is off, and comedic timing is very specific. And so there are moments where jokes are told and you kind of register, oh, that was really funny, like moments after it's already been told. Some of the performances in this film were a bit off as well and a bit inconsistent. Notably, unfortunately, the two young leads, one of them is Thandie Newton's daughter, and she looks so much like her, it's amazing. And I think she's incredibly talented, no doubt she's gonna go places, but I have to say that this performance was quite disappointing in general. She was very stoic, she was very almost robotic, the line readings were off. Like, it was very emotionless. Sometimes they're really upset and, you know, something sad happens with the elephants and you don't register that sadness from her. So I would say her performance was quite wooden in the film. Her brother was slightly better. Her brother in the film, not in real life. But again, these two kids did not shine. They weren't as charismatic. And it's important because Like I said, this film is designed to basically tell the story of Dumbo through the eyes of these two kids. And so you need to have kids that are really charismatic. They really shine in the way that Mowgli did in the Jungle Book remake. He was captivating. He was electric on screen. Even though he was surrounded by all this CG, you felt like this was a real person that you were connecting with. These kids, they had a largely human cast to go off on, and they were just quite robotic, quite stoic, and I didn't really connect to them on an emotional level. I think in terms of the villain of this film, Michael Keaton plays a very interesting character on paper, and actually there are a few interesting things about this character that I will get to in perhaps a spoiler portion in this video, right at the very end. But without saying too much now, I'll just say that I think the way in which he depicted the character was perhaps a bit inconsistent. Again, it felt like some of the line readings were a bit off. Some jokes are told in a very non-jokey way. Like, it's basically like some of the jokes on paper are really, really funny, but the way that they're delivered don't do them justice. And it's a much funnier film than you'd think, you know, considering all of the advertising and the marketing. There are some funny jokes in there, but again, they also kind of clash with the overall tone of the film, which is very, very sad, very melancholy. So I would say that there were a few issues with his performance. It's slightly inconsistent, and particularly at the end, he does a whole 180-degree turn in terms of how his character acts. It's very bizarre. It just doesn't quite match up to the character that we get to know early on in the film, because in the end he goes insane. And finally, Ava Green is in this film because it's a Tim Burton film and she's the new Helena Bonham Carter. Even though her character becomes more likable as the film goes on, she plays this French woman who speaks French, and je suis français. And that's pretty much the bulk of what the character is. Apart from this very interesting line that she has in the film, that I'll leave it down on the screen here. But that actually really caught my attention. I thought that was a really, really good line. But other than that, yeah, she's a French woman, that's it. And on top of that, I don't even think she's necessary to the overall story. We spend so little time with the Medici circus group that when it comes to bringing in her character, it feels like their storylines are watered down even more. And she isn't even given the full justice that she deserves as a fully fleshed out character. And so you end up with a very weird situation where all of the supporting characters are pretty much irrelevant. They're just there to fill up spaces. Or in the case of Ava Green's character, just there to fulfill an unnecessary love story between her and Colin Farrell. As I just mentioned, we don't actually get to spend a lot of time with the Medici circus performers. They're very much background characters, and we don't really get to know them very well. And yet the story seems to want us to believe that they're one connected unit, they're one family, they care for one another. But it's very unconvincing because we don't ever get to fully explore the dynamics within the circus and really appreciate how much of a connective group that they are. If we had spent much more time exploring the group dynamics within the story at the beginning of the film, I would say that would have connected us better with the Medici circus so that we are rooting for them. And also the CG in this film. Now, I feel like Disney is kind of continuing on its tradition at this point of having excellent, amazing CGI in some scenes and just atrocious video game footage in others. And what I mean by that is that there are moments where Dumbo looks photorealistic. Like, it is insane. This is a character who, for the most part, anatomically is correct, but his ears obviously are fake, and also he has those Tim Burton wide eyes that make him so adorable and so amazing. We'll get to Dumbo when I get to the good parts of this, but just in general, there are moments where it's spectacular, like compliments to the chef, brilliant. And then there's moments where I'm like, oh, who turned on the PS3? Like, it's so atrociously bad, and it's usually when someone is flying on him. I think that's when things get a bit rocky. You know, they didn't get a consultant from the Game of Thrones team to come in and look over that because they needed someone to help them out with the flying and someone riding him whilst he was flying, because no, that was atrocious. Also, aside from Dumbo himself, there are a lot of Tim Burton-isms in the world. It's very grey and grungy, and it feels dirty almost, and that's kind of iconic for his work. But it does rely upon a lot of CG, and it gave the film a lot of Alice in Wonderland aesthetics where things look interesting, but if they were more clarified almost or more defined, it would feel real. And I think a huge teller of that is when things are happening but the world doesn't seem to react. Like, we hear the sound of wind, we see Dumbo flying, but nothing is rattling around, nothing is moving around as a result of the flying. So you end up with a very still room with a lot of action happening. It doesn't quite resonate as being real or realistic. And finally, one of my issues with this film just in general is that I feel like this film misses out on a lot of the joy and innocence that Dumbo, the original film, had. And that film had a lot of weird aspects to it too, like Dumbo gets drunk and there's a lot of weird imagery, and also it was a film of its time for several reasons which we'll get to. But it did have that sense of innocence. But this film, it did not feel like a children's film at all. It's so sad and so depressing. Overall, I just don't think Tim Burton fit the tone of what a Dumbo film needed to be in order to resonate with children of this generation. I think he created a film that's great for perhaps preteens, people the ages of, 8 to 12 to 13. They could kind of resonate with this story. But anything younger, and I think it would be really depressing to watch. And it's a shame because they don't get to explore this new version of a story that so many people have enjoyed in the past. But it's not all bad. So let's get into some of the good stuff. First of all, like I said, Dumbo is the star of this show. He is adorable. He's so amazing. I absolutely loved him with all of my heart. And again, it's such a sad film for the majority of the runtime. So there wasn't a dry eye in the room. There was a point in time where something happens and people were crying around me, and these were adults. They weren't kids. So it's just a really sad film, but he is brilliant. And because you feel for him and you connect with him, it just makes the story even better. So even though they may have slacked off with some of the human characters, I think they did Dumbo himself justice. Second of all, there was one human character that really stood out and really impressed me, and that was Colin Farrell's character. I think he was absolutely brilliant in this film. He was by far the best one. You really were able to relate to him and to feel for him as he comes back from war, and he's going through a completely different experience, having lost a limb, trying to find out what his place is in the circus and how he's supposed to re-identify with his kids after his experience in the war. I think he's a tragic character, but it's one that's filled with hope and filled with encouragement. The fact that you're able to see him be determined and driven despite the struggles that he's going through, I think is absolutely amazing and so uplifting in a film that is largely very depressing. It put his character at the emotional core of the film instead of the kids. Thirdly, the pink elephant sequence. Oh my god. One of the things that I really enjoyed about Beauty and the Beast, the live action remake, was the Be Our Guest sequence. I think it was absolutely spectacular. This is how you demonstrate what CG can achieve, where 2D animation was unable to. This is where you elevate the source material. And I think if more of the film had had that, I would have had a better impression of it. But that pink elephant sequence almost was worth the price of admission because it was brilliant. Danny Elfman's rendition of that song was brilliant. And in the film, Dumbo, spoiler alert, Dumbo is like dancing along to the song, and I was dancing along right with him. I was like, yes, the elephant's on parade. This was amazing. It was absolutely spectacular and I loved it. I think it was way too short. I could have just watched that for the majority of the film. And also I will say in general, when they enter Dreamland, which is Michael Keaton's version of the circus or something else, it's absolutely spectacular and it really captures the imagination. And this is the kind of thing that, again, I think elevates the source material because you were able to go into a completely different world. And as I mentioned earlier, this film was a product of its time, and in the original Dumbo, there were these characters who were the crows, and they were caricatures of Black people down in the South, and one of the crows was called Jim Crow. Very on the nose. I would say that it was an intelligent move on Disney's part to completely get rid of those crow characters, and instead they kind of substituted an African American character who had a bit more to do in the film and was a bit more substantial in the film, but I wouldn't say that he was a fully fleshed out side character by any means. None of them were, to be honest. But I would say that it was a positive move on Disney's behalf to choose not to include the crows. Having said that, I did actually really enjoy When I See an Elephant Fly. I think it's one of my favorite Disney animated classic songs. I would say that a nod to that song could have perhaps been appreciated by some Disney animated fans. They did do a very emotional and heartbreaking rendition of Baby Mine. That's another song that is absolutely beautiful. So overall, I would say that Dumbo is not my favorite live action remake from Disney. I much preferred The Jungle Book and even Cinderella. I would say this maybe falls in line with Alice in Wonderland. Though Alice in Wonderland, which was also directed by Tim Burton, I would say was a much better fit for him, just aesthetically. I think Dumbo should have been done by someone who had a bit more childlike wonder in them, instead of creating a very solemn film. I would have liked to see something that was more hopeful and optimistic. So with all of that said, I'm going to give Dumbo, the live action remake, a 6 out of 10. So now let's get into a bit of a discussion of this film, and there will be a few spoilers here, so if you don't want to know anything about it, then you could go ahead and sign off now. Thank you guys so much for watching. But I did want to mention a few things that really got my attention about this film. First off, the end was such a lovely surprise. Now, throughout this film, what made it really sad for me is, first off, the way that Tim Burton presented it, but also the fact that it's a story about an abused animal, a few abused animals working in the circus. I don't think in this day and time that a story like this could really be celebrated unless it had ended the way that it did. I think it was absolutely genius of Tim Burton to flip the switch in that way and get those elephants back home where they belong, in the wild, in their home environment, so that they connect with other elephants instead of being things to be gawked at and ridiculed. I absolutely thought that that was the right way to go, because honestly, if he had just ended up going back to the circus, even the Medici circus, it would have been very bittersweet for me, because the way that he was treated, even by the Medici circus performers, was just so sad and so atrocious. So I think that the ending very much adds points to the film, because this is something new that they added to this film that really elevated it, in my opinion. And secondly, what was really interesting to me is that, am I crazy, or is Michael Keaton Walt Disney and is Dreamland Disneyland? Is this film a low-key, high-key way of Tim Burton to shade Disney? Because I don't know why Tim Burton would bite the hand that feeds him. But I think it is a very interesting layer to the story, the fact that Vandermeer so closely resembles to Walt Disney, and his personified fantasy land is represented in this film as a horrible, horrible place that is a facade covering up so much injustice and maltreatment of animals and even people. I think that's a very interesting commentary that he has there. I don't understand how the Disney execs were like, okay, yeah, this is great. They not clock that Dreamland has a lot of characteristics in common with the real life Disneyland. Michael Keaton's character is very much a Walt Disney type character. He's an entertainer. There's nothing genuine about him. What does that say about Tim Burton's view of Walt Disney and Disneyland in general? And finally, what I really did appreciate is that little stork reference to the original film. When Dumbo is about to be born, a stork comes along and visits his mother, and then we find out that he's just there in the hay. I absolutely love that. I thought that was so endearing. But what I didn't enjoy is the mice. I thought that the mouse in the original film was a much bigger character. I think it's a shame that they just relegated him to a glorified cameo. And I think it's really bizarre how Disney has kind of chosen which talking animals to represent in these live action remakes. Like the cutlery in Beauty and the Beast can definitely talk, but the mice in Dumbo can't. The mice in Cinderella, I don't think were able to speak either. But Iago definitely is able to speak. So it's really weird how they've chosen, like, no, you can't talk. That's ridiculous. But you you can definitely speak. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys what I thought of Dumbo, you can tell me what your thoughts were down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to my channel to catch any new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!